second ever workshop, so we are acquiring that habit. Is it the third? Maybe the third workshop, second or third, but we are building in that practice around timely matters. It is October 7th at 6:30 p.m.
No.
Ninth is the ninth.
9th.
Did you start the cameras?
We'll edit that part out.
There's
This is
nobody outside looking
a
lost.
workshop of the Auburn Water
I
District.
go, the fall is going too fast.
It's
So try
going
to back
very
up the
fast
bus.
on
a little.
October 9th of 2019, 6:30 p.m. And
Thank you, Mike.
I'd like to welcome everybody to this presentation on what has been done in understanding and studying filtration for the lake. Some people here probably know this inside out, and some of us, and I confess I would be among them, and not completely familiar with all the studies that have been done. And given that it's a topic of importance to our community, it always begins with understanding what has been done. So I'll turn this over to our superintendent, Sid, and I'm going to go sit back over there so I can also see.
Great, thank you.
Can you go on?
Oh, let's introduce ourselves.
Sure.
I'm Mary Sylvester, and I'm president of the Auburn Water District.
I'm Tiz Crowley, and I'm a trustee.
Independent City Council Award 3 and trustee for the mayor.
Paul Kavanaugh, trustee.
Casey Geiger, trustee.
Sarah Strong, interested citizen.
We love those kind.
Jason Paulina, trustee.
Brian Carrier, interested citizen and running for Ward 4 Council.
And I'm Sid Hazelton, the water and sewer superintendent. So, what I've got here is a presentation on water quality and filtration considerations. I don't know how we want to run this, if people have questions as I'm going.
Well, let's hold
or
them so
hold the
that we
questions
can
till the end.
stay. That's with our
Okay.
notebooks. Unless it's a quick question, but let's write our questions down so you can run the presentation, and then we'll have time for questions at the end.
Okay.
And
Hopefully, oh,
here we have
there's
one more person.
Katie
Jeff.
Bob.
Hey, Katie.
Come on in and have a seat.
Yeah, an empty seat over there.
Yeah, right here if you like.
Thank you so
And
much.
Don't trip
let's
on the
just
floor.
do one
Appreciate
more
it.
Certainly.
go round of introductions, just so we all know.
Thank you, I'm Katie Ross.
Yeah, Sid Hazelton, water superintendent.
You know me, we spend a lot of time together.
Jason Paulina, trustee.
I'm Sarah Strong, interested citizen.
Casey Geiger. She knows me, I'm a neighbor.
There we go.
That's nice.
Hi, Andy Titus, Ward 3, City Council.
We know each other, that's good. Yeah, good.
Okay, let us begin. And we're gonna do questions at the end.
Okay.
Unless you have a quick kind of clarifying question, but it's easy otherwise to get derailed. And there's a lot of good information here.
Hopefully, hopefully I put this in a decent chronological order, so, there are some things I'll be showing you that might, spawn some questions, but hopefully those will be covered later in the slides.
That's what I found.
We'll see, we'll see. Anyhow, we're here to talk about, water quality and filtration considerations. The outline of this presentation kind of broke it into 3 separate segments. Number 1, talking about the history of how we've gone about meeting the drinking water regulations. I always like to take, it kind of drives some people crazy, but I always like to take a little step back before going ahead. So I got a little piece on the drinking water regulations, the relevant ones that kind of got us where we are today. The second part is going to be talking about consideration for filtering our water. And the third part is going to be what the future holds for us in terms of water quality. Many of you know this, but it's worth pointing out again. Lake Auburn is the only public water supply for Lewiston and Auburn. We have done studies in the past, but there is no backup source. That's makes Auburn and Lewiston kind of unique. If you look around the cities around Maine, a lot of them do get surface water supply, but they also have some redundant supply in case their primary goes bad. A lot of them have backup groundwater wells. A lot of them are interconnected with other nearby communities, so they always have some backup source. We do not, and that is what makes Lake Auburn so precious and so vital. We did do some studies, back along to see if there were viable groundwater sources available. If you look at the geology around Lake Auburn, to the north of the lake is a gravel pit, to the south of the lake is a gravel pit. And so there was always an assumption that those two gravel pits were connected basically under the lake. And gravel is a great aquifer, holds a lot of water normally. So we were hopeful that, that we could find a decent source of groundwater. We went out, we did seismic testing, we actually did some test drilling. Viable water source to supply both cities we were looking in the 5 to 6 million gallon per range average. We were only able to find something roughly in the 2 million gallon range. So that was simply not adequate for us to move forward. Unfortunately, what we found was instead of having a nice, clean aquifer, there were several layers of what's called presumpscot formation, basically clay, that was left from the times that the state was covered in ocean. And when that receded, there were lenses of clay and perched groundwater with, in some areas of Auburn, I know some people have tried to drill wells and they found that the water is brackish and contains salt. So long story short, we were not able to find another viable source. Both Auburn and Lewiston do have reservoir storage, but realistically, that would only last a couple of days, given the volume of water we use and having to have enough fire protection. So that makes protecting the lake even that more important. Our water, we do treat the water, obviously, to meet drinking water standards. It's treated with chlorine, chloramines, and chloramines is basically adding ammonia to the chlorine that that makes the chlorine last longer in the distribution system, so it's available in the system for keeping it clean. We have over 130 miles of water mains in the city, and so by the time the water gets from the lake out to the outer reaches, we have to make sure that it's still performing that disinfecting function. So that's why we form chloramines. We also have UV light for disinfection. I'll get into that a little bit later, but that's another system we have for neutralizing any bacteria or viruses that might be in the water. We use sodium hydroxide and carbon dioxide for adjusting the pH and alkalinity of the water. We add phosphate to sequester lead. And sequestering lead, you might have seen in the publications that, you know, we test quite often for lead. Any lead that we find in our water, 99.9% of it would be found in people's plumbing, not in our water distribution system. A lot of the older homes built around the 1950s or so had either lead solder joints put in quite commonly, or plumbing fixtures that contain lead. So the phosphate we add to the water puts a very microscopic film on the inside of our distribution piping, and also people's home plumbing to keep that lead from leaching into the water. We also add fluoride to the water to help battle tooth decay.
Sid, could I just add, Sid can send you this PowerPoint electronically if you don't wanna take notes on everything.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Just going through a little bit of history, we do have quite a long history of meeting drinking water standards. The significant portion of this presentation goes back to starting in 1986, sort of in the modern past, if you will, when the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, when they put out an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act to put a whole bunch of standards in place that drinking water systems had to meet. That prompted us back the following year, in 1987, to go forward with a study. We used Camp Dresser and McKee, or CDM, you'll see them later on. That's what that acronym is, Camp Dresser and McKee. It's an engineering company out of Boston. They performed a comprehensive watershed study around the lake to see things we should or should not be looking for. In 1991, we established a watershed control program, and in that same year is when we submitted to the EPA a request to get an exemption to not have to filter the water. Those rules that were put in place back in 1986 said if you can't meet certain drinking water standards, you must filter the water. So in 1993, because we had over 100 years, basically, of water protection, the quality of the water in Lake Auburn was exceptional. We put in an application and we were granted permission to not have to filter the water prior to sending it off to the customers. In the approval that they gave us, the margin by which we were able to not have to filter the water was really razor thin. We can lose that waiver at any time if we fail to meet the drinking water standards. And part of that exemption application we put in was to form in 1993 the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. So that was put in place back in 1993. It's a 9-member board, and it's comprised of 3 members from Lewiston, 3 from Auburn, 1 from the town of Turner, 1 to represent the towns of Hebron, Minot, and Buckfield, and 1 is the executive director of the Androscoggin Valley Council of Governments. Now, the reason why there were people on that commission that aren't from Lewiston or Auburn is if you look at a map, the actual watershed, the boundary of the land that the water drains into Lake Auburn, it not only encompasses Auburn, it goes up into those neighboring towns. It goes up into Turner, Buckfield, Minot, and a little bit of Hebron. So, when that commission was put in place, a number of things were put in there to as their charges. Their main goal is to preserve and protect Lake Auburn, to maintain our waiver of filtration. It's right in the bylaws, that's why they exist. So when they were put into place, there were a number of things that they were charged with doing. We now do active septic system surveys. There was a new zoning ordinance put in place, a Lake Auburn overlay, where there were certain restrictions on what you can and can't do in land around the lake. They're active in land preservation. There's about 2,100 acres of land around Lake Auburn, which are controlled in various forms. We have land ownership, we have conservation easements, we have life estates. So in that combination, those are all ways that we can make sure that we can keep that lake as healthy as possible by controlling what goes on around the lake. We have an active forestry management program. Lake restrictions were put in place. We have quite a few restrictions. We always are kind of riding the fine line. We want to be good neighbors, but we also want to make sure that we're protecting the lake and the water, everyone's water supply. We do watershed surveys, and we also have courtesy boat inspections that are done every year, looking for invasive plants. Back in 1993, there was another study that was done looking at the disinfection requirement for Giardia and different types of viruses. We upgraded our chlorination system. We also performed a coliform bacteria study back then. In 1996 is when we put in a 900-foot long intake pipe extension. Prior to that time, there were separate water intakes. In 1996, we put in it was a 48-inch diameter pipe that serves both cities. In 2005, we were noticing that we were getting, as we tested the lake, we noticed we were getting some bacteria hits in the lake. After a long study, we found out that that was due to migrating birds, migrating gulls. We almost lost our filtration waiver back in 2005 because of that, but we were able to identify what it was, and we put into place a waterfowl control program. We contract with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to do that, and that's something that continues today. In 2007, we completed a ultraviolet light concept design report. There were some new regulations that came out that had to make all the water systems across the country guard against certain bacteria. And a lot of water systems like us did concept studies, and a lot of them ended up going with UV, just like we did. 2009 is when we started the actual construction of our ultraviolet light disinfection facility. 2010, we completed a watershed management plan that's due for an upgrade next year. Every 10 years, we like to do a comprehensive watershed management plan that contains a lot of the programs that we need to do. 2011, we finished the first phase of the UV treatment facility, which included the raw and finished water pumping. 2012, we did phases 2 and 3, which was the chemical building and the laboratory and admin building. 2012, if you remember back, and most of the people around this table know, that was the year that we experienced a algae bloom. What happened then, we had the remnants of a hurricane come through, and we had almost 18 inches of rain dumped in a very short period of time. That caused a lot of nutrients to be washed into the lake. It was a very, very heavy rainstorm, so there was a lot of erosion that occurred, a lot of the dam around the basin breached, and a lot of contaminants got into the lake. That was followed by a very hot, very dry period, and all those nutrients in the lake just kind of sat there and baked all summer. A very, very odd situation happened. That caused an algae bloom. All those nutrients, the warm water, we had an algae bloom. When the algae died, sank to the bottom of the lake, and when it sank to the bottom of the lake, bacteria was consuming the algae. When that happened, that used up all the oxygen that was in the bottom of the lake. And that happened to be where all the lake trout like to go in the summer, the bottom of the lake, where it's nice and cool. But there was no oxygen for them, and we were actually experiencing a die-off of lake trout. That really set the alarm off for us and put into place quite a few things. In 2014, we commandeered another study that recommended a multi-barrier approach to keeping our water clean, and that's something I'll talk about a little later. One thing that we did after 2012 is we applied for a permit from the Department of Environmental Protection that if we ever did have another algae bloom, we would be able to apply copper sulfate to the lake. That is an algicide. We had several years of pretty good water quality after that 2012 episode. Last fall, 2018, we noticed, and we tracked this very closely, we noticed that there was the start of another algae bloom that was going on. So we actually applied copper sulfate to a 300-acre parcel kind of around the intake to basically kill that algae prior to it getting to a full bloom condition. We were trying to avoid what happened in 2012, and we did avoid that by applying copper sulfate. our plan, going way back to 2013, we knew that if it became necessary to apply copper sulfate to the lake, we would follow that up with a subsequent treatment. We had 3 different things we were considering at the time. Number 1 was a alum treatment. We also considered in-lake aeration. We also considered kind of a much more desperate measure, which would have been actually dredging the lake to dredge up the sediments and remove them. But that was not practical. That one was eliminated quite early in the discussion. Aeration of the lake was considered, but again, it wasn't exactly known whether that would help the lake or actually hurt the lake, because being susceptible to algae blooms, introducing air, that might actually cause things to stir up rather than getting the advantage of oxygenating the lake. We ultimately decided through several meetings with all the stakeholders that alum was going to be the most reasonable alternative. The way alum works, and that's a process that we're doing right now. We hope to be done in about a week and a half. That's a process we're doing right now, is applying alum to the lake. Aluminum is it's a coagulant. It basically is a substance that things cling to. Once they, alum in the water can cling to any available phosphorus that's in the water. Phosphorus is the main algae food. That's what algae lives on, is phosphorus. So alum can bind up to the available phosphorus in the water column and grab it and sink it to the bottom of the lake. And once it's in the bottom of the lake, it has the added effect of binding with the sediment that's at the bottom of the lake. Our lake bottom is naturally high in iron, which is not a ideal situation, because any phosphorus that is in the iron-bound sediments, if a lake goes anoxic like ours can at times, when the lake goes anoxic, that can release phosphorus from the iron-bound sediments. So that is a...
So the anoxic is when.
Anoxic is when there's no oxygen.
Oxygen goes to
Yes,
zero.
that's right. So if the bottom, if we have an algae bloom, algae dies, goes to the bottom, the oxygen gets used up because we have a lot of the element iron in the bottom of the lake. If it goes anoxic, that can release phosphorus from the sediments. So that's not a good thing. So aluminum, as I mentioned, in addition to stripping the phosphorus from the water column, it can also bind up the iron-bound sediments, which is a secondary benefit. A lot of lakes are naturally high in aluminum. Those are some of the highest quality lakes around. If you've got aluminum in your lake, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, Auburn does not naturally have a lot of aluminum in the lake. As a matter of fact, a lot of the geography of the surrounding watershed is made up of the mineral apatite. And apatite is naturally high in phosphorus. So as...
We're 2 for 2.
Yeah, so as the soils around the lake eventually erode over many, many years, that's a natural source of phosphorus that gets into the lake. So that's not a great recipe. So, given that background, we're gonna move into consideration for filtering the water. Okay. This is,
Sid,
yep.
can I get you something to drink out of the refrigerator for you or anything?
Nope, I got my water right here.
Okay, you're all set. Oh, I thought that might be Brian's. Okay.
Thanks. What I've got here is just a little cartoon from something that the EPA has on their website. There are many ways to filter water. There are many types of systems out there. This diagram that I've got here is what's known most commonly as conventional filtration. And there are really four processes involved in filtration. There's coagulation, sedimentation, which is sometimes called flocculation, filtration, and then disinfection. If you can just kind of imagine, here's Lake Auburn. If we were going to go with a conventional filtration system, the first step being coagulation. As I just mentioned to you, alum is a very common coagulant. When it mixes with water, it binds particles together. So if you can imagine this phase as the water comes in out of the lake, if we were to have a filter plant, a conventional filter plant, the first step being coagulation is when we could add alum to the water. It mixes around. It goes to the second phase, which is called sedimentation. That's where the heavy particles sink to the bottom, and then they're transported out. The water without particles in it goes to the next phase, which is called filtration. Comes into a large basin, and just by gravity, the water will go down through different layers of material. It could be gravel, it could be activated carbon. So once the water goes down through that, then it will go through a disinfection process, which is basically what we have now. Right now, our water comes from Lake Auburn. We bypass all this, it goes directly to disinfection and then to the customer. So all this part is what we don't currently have through a filtration process. Filtration commonly removes any particles in the water, bacteria, viruses, chemicals. The effectiveness of that filter system depends on the type of filter used, the size of it, the overall size, and the pore openings, like the space between all the little sand particles that are in the filter media. So that is all, that kind of indicates how effective your filter system is going to be. I'll explain a few other types in a second here. As I already mentioned to you in the earlier slides, our drinking water is not filtered. Due to the excellent water quality that we've had for so long, we were granted a waiver in 1993. And as I mentioned before, it states right in that letter we got from them that the waiver can be pulled if there are efforts to relax lake protection efforts, or if the water ever fails to meet the stringent drinking water standards. Now, as a result of that filtration waiver that we have, we enjoy some of the lowest water rates in the state. We're in the lower third anyway. This chart, it's a few years old, but it's still relevant. This is a list of most of the major water systems across the state. It includes Portland, Brunswick, Kennebunk, Yarmouth, Lewiston, Brunswick, Augusta, Bangor, Sanford, Scarborough. It's most of the water systems across the state. As you can see, here is where Auburn is. We are in the lower third of all the other water systems out there. Just some relevant ones. Lewiston is right here. They're just a little bit higher than we are. I always like to point that out. I don't know why, but I do. But this is a direct result of us not having to filter the water.
Customer size on this too.
How many of those municipalities filter?
Well, I'll get into that in just a minute.
Okay.
There's
You said
another
because of
slide that kind of
filtration,
shows
you keep
that.
low rates, so I just want to
Right.
know which ones do
Right.
they go.
Yeah, I'll get into that in just a
Okay.
minute.
Thank God doesn't.
Now, I know that there's a lot of buzz out there about filtering our water. You know, why don't we filter our water? Or why haven't we considered it? Why don't we do it? Actually, if you go back and look at the things we've done, filtering, the option of filtering our water has been under consideration going all the way back, at least to 1991, when we applied for the waiver and received it from the Environmental Protection Agency. It's never been, it's always been an option, it's never been the preferred option due to the high capital and annual maintenance costs that would go along with it. In addition to that, because we are susceptible to algae blooms, as we've seen from the last two episodes, filter systems are, there's no real guarantee that a filter system can address the taste and odor issues that result from the presence of algae. They can filter out the algae themselves, but the taste and odor that might be associated as a secondary consideration is something that filters might not address. It should be noted, as you'll see in the following slides, I've got quite a bit of research that's been done on the cost of filtration, but we have never commandeered for Lewiston Auburn a full filtration plant design. We know there are a lot of them out there that are similar to what we'd have to do, but we've never actually done a filtration plant, full filtration plant design for us. In order to get an accurate number, you need to design it, and then you need to put it out to bid and find out exactly what you've got for a cost. But that's never, it's never been done. That being said, back in 1991, as I said, that's when we got our waiver of filtration. 2005, that's back when we were looking at that bacteria hit that we got from those migrating gulls, as I mentioned. CDM, again, Camp Dresser McKee, back in 2005, did some estimates for us. A couple of, as I mentioned, there are several ways to skin the cat. They did an estimate back in 2005, a membrane filter with chlorine. You can see the price range from $25 to $33 million is what it might cost us. A direct filtration plant with ozone was in the $42 million range. Direct filtration with ozone contactors, that was a little more expensive. That was up in the $50 million range from their estimates at that time. So again, these are almost 15 years old, these estimates. Back in 2007, as I mentioned, is when we did the design of the UV plant that's up there and running today. One thing that we did at that time, we had the foresight to design the UV plant with the thought that if we ever did lose our filtration waiver, have to put in a filtration system, that facility was designed in order to accommodate a future filtration plant. The space was allocated, the plumbing was put in such that a modular unit could go into what was already been constructed. Back in 2010, the superintendent at the time, John Storer, this subject came up almost 10 years ago. And there was a report done. John Storer at the time was the superintendent here, and he wrote in a report that his estimate was $15 to $30 million to add filtration equipment to the UV plant, and to assume the high end due to the type of treatment most likely needed. Back in January of this year, I did contact Wright Pierce engineers down in Topsom, and this is a little excerpt from the report that they gave me. The highlight of this report is they came back and told us that a 16 million gallon per day filtration facility to supplement existing disinfection and pumping facilities at Lake Auburn would cost between $45 and $47 million. to construct and commission. So this is an example of as up-to-date an estimate as I could get for, what it would cost. So this was January of this year that I had them do a study for us. And they
And one quick
designed-
question there, because you said that we have a plant that's got space ready and plumbing
does.
ready.
Yeah.
Does this assume that we have a space ready, or is that during?
don't.
Well,
Yeah, it
if
says
you,
that.
yeah, if you go
adequate
to,
site for the proposed.
Well, aggregate site and not wetlands, but if we already got a facility built, we just don't
No,
have
we
the
don't,
space built.
no, we don't have the space built.
no,
No, I thought
We
you
just
said.
have some pipes that go out the end of the building
Oh.
that would go into a new building that would be
I
the
got you.
filtration.
Okay.
one of the things, well, let me go forward, I think I'll answer my own thing here. One thing that comes up quite often is, as I mentioned early on, there are several different ways that you can filter the water. Some facilities have what's known as membrane filtration. It's quite simply, there are a series of tubes, and in them are spaghetti-like filters. The water goes through them, and that's the extent of your filtration. That is, in general, the cheapest type of filtration you can do, but because we have the presence of algae, you cannot do membrane filtration alone. That can be a component of it. In that Wright Pierce study, I didn't print the whole thing off, but their estimate was based upon needing a process called dissolved air flotation. This is kind of a diagram of what that is. Dissolved air flotation is basically you get water in a big circular tank, you introduce air bubbles into it, dissolved air under pressure, the bubbles come in, and that will make any type of impurity floating around the water tend to rise to the top, and then there is a large skimmer that goes around, skims it off. And then you could follow that type of process with a membrane type filter. And that is the kind of system that Wright Pierce had in mind when they did that estimate of $45 to $47 million. A dissolved air flotation unit followed by membrane filtration. One thing I also did was I commandeered a study from Weston and Sampson Engineers. That's an outfit that we use quite often for various projects. They have a lot of experience designing and overseeing construction of drinking water filter plants all over New England. So I told them, hey, can you give me some of your estimates based upon plants that you've seen? And you can see, without going through a whole lot of detail, their price ranges are all kind of the same, even though they're different processes. You know, a membrane filtration plant, 30 million. Dissolved air flotation, as I just mentioned, followed by sand filtration, 28 million. Conventional treatment, and that was the cartoon slide I showed you in the beginning, 28 million. After getting this from them, one thing they mentioned to me as well is knowing that we have or can have algae in our water, this would most likely need to be followed up by a carbon treatment. And that could add $2 million to your estimates. So, you know, we're in the $30 to $32 million range was their best estimate based upon the projects they have recently done around New England. Here are some filtration plants. I did a little research that do exist right here in Maine. Kennebec, that is the water treatment plant that serves Waterville, Winslow. They've got a 12 million gallon per day granular activated carbon filtration system. That was built in 1993. That cost them $22 million. Brunswick, they're quite a bit smaller. They've got a total organic carbon type filter system. That cost them $35 million back in 2010. Currently, the city of Saco right now is just about to break ground on a new conventional water filtration system, 12 million gallons a day, and that's about the size of what we need. They're estimating $45 million is what they're looking at spending on their system. The city of Bangor, back in 2009, we have some real parallels with the city of Bangor, because they were undergoing the same studies we were at the same time. So I'm in contact with Bangor quite often on what they're doing and what they're finding. They ended up doing the exact same thing we did. Back in 2009, they were studying, do we put in a filter plant? Do we put in a UV plant? Ironically, they were finding the same thing we did. From an engineering estimate they put together, their estimates were between $30 and $55 million to put in a filter plant. That was based upon an engineering estimate. They ended up going with UV treatment, just like we did. They went through the exact same process and came to the exact same conclusion. What would be the financial impact of installing? I picked the number $35 million, sort of a middle of the road. You know, you can go up a little, down a little. I put $35 million in there. I based that upon, if you take the Wright Pierce study, they assumed we would have a 16 million gallon per day facility. I think based upon some other estimates we've done, I think a 12 million gallon per day facility would be adequate for our needs. So I scaled down that number a little bit from 45 and kind of averaged it with some of the other numbers I had, and just went with a $35 million filter plant. Based upon our current cost sharing agreements that we have with the city of Lewiston, just assuming for argument's sake right now that we split the cost right down the middle with Lewiston, we would need to bond $17.5 million for construction. Now, one thing that a filter plant adds to your budget, it's estimated there would be another, a total of $1.5 million per year to operate that facility. So if we split that with Lewiston, we'd be looking at $750,000 per year, every year, for operation and maintenance. A filter plant requires more electricity, more chemicals, more disposal costs, because you're creating a sludge material that has to be either to go into the sewer system or landfill. You're looking at additional plant, you're looking at additional employees. And that's something that would happen every year. A quick calculation of that, we would need to raise our water rates 50% over current rates to cover these additional costs. By doing some quick math, for a typical family, this would increase the annual water bill by $125.
And how much then sewer? Because if your water bill goes up, your sewer bill goes up.
True. Yep, I didn't even do that on sewer.
That would be extra income that wouldn't cost the sewer department. They need more money, but they get more money.
Right, that's.
So that has nothing to do with that.
No, but that's even worse for the customer.
No, it wouldn't affect sewer.
Well,
The sewer rates are based on water rates.
it might, it might increase the volume of sewer that, depending on if you landfill it or if it goes in the sewer system.
Well, the ratepayers aren't gonna be, it's not gonna affect their sewer bill for a residence
Correct,
person.
correct, no, yeah, you're right, it's not going to
Because-
affect the residential sewer.
Because that's based on sewer
Right,
costs.
it would all be water cost, it would all be
Yeah.
water
It'll go
cost.
into water,
It could increase the
right.
sewer bill to the district that would be incurred by the water
The
rate.
water
payers.
district would have to
Correct.
charge pay that
Correct.
to the sewer district.
Correct.
Households still gonna use the same amount of water.
Yeah.
Now, here's a real kicker that most people aren't gonna know unless you really do the analysis. The fire protection charges that we charge the city, every year we charge the city, for the fire hydrants that we have out there. The only reason we have our reservoir system, over 70 million gallons of storage, why we have so many fire hydrants, that is for fire protection. And we are mandated to charge a certain percent by the Public Utilities Commission formula. And what we charge is a percentage of our overall revenue. So if our revenue goes up in order to fund a filtration plant, the fire charges go up to the city. If we had a rate increase of 50%, the annual public fire protection charges would increase from right now, they're in the $670,000 range. That would go to over $1 million a year. So you'd have a $330,000 increase on fire protection charges.
And that would be paid by taxpayers then?
That's paid, that is a bill we send to the city of Auburn, so that would be incurred by the taxpayers.
You know, if the number holds true, that did back in my old days, every 100,000 is 5 cents on your tax bill, so we're looking at about 18 cents on your tax bill per 1,000 for just this change.
Okay, thanks.
Now, there's some real key takeaways here. Even if tomorrow or in the future, if we lose our filtration waiver, our watershed protection efforts must remain in place. As you can see from the way some of those filter plants were designed, you need clean source water if a filtration system is going to function properly. You can't let your source water get dirty and then hope you're going to filter it out later in your system. That just does not work that way. Algae can foul filters and significantly increase treatment costs. And as I mentioned before, filters may not eliminate taste and odor issues associated with algae. I think you all, or quite a few of us remember last fall, just around Thanksgiving time, we did have an issue with a certain type of algae. It was called cyanura, which did cause some taste and odor issues. So a filter plant might not even be effective in that type of situation. Now, going into the third phase of this, talking about some future approaches to water quality, as I mentioned, one of the earlier studies that was done in 2014 talked about adopting a multi-barrier approach to water quality. There's not just one thing we're doing, there are many things we're doing. In terms of the lake itself, as I mentioned, we are doing watershed protection through the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. A few years ago, we reorganized a little bit. We hired a full-time watershed manager. We also have, under the watershed manager, a public education and outreach coordinator, very important position for getting the word out there, doing a lot of social events and just raising awareness of how important it is to keep our lake as clean as possible. We do an absolute ton of lake and watershed monitoring and testing. We test the lake every day. We test the tributaries coming into the lake to make sure that we can keep ahead of what's coming in. We have funded environmental and erosion control projects through the commission. And one thing that's really kind of special about Lake Auburn, it really is a unique lake. I'm told time and time again that Lake Auburn is one of the most interesting lakes in the world, and it really is. There is we have a team of experts who are constantly monitoring what's going on. We have staff, scientists, consultants, academia, regulators, state agencies. When I say academia, we have a very special relationship with Bates College. One person in particular, Holly Ewing, has spent years studying the lake, taking samples, graphing results of what's going on, taking a special interest in all the biota that's in the lake. We've also worked with the University of Maine. When I mentioned, one of the most interesting lakes in the world, that's because that's what was told to me by, Dr. Norton, who is a, retired professor from the University of Maine, who has spent a lot of time with his team doing samples of the lake, doing soil samples, and investigating those and trying to figure out why the lake does what it does. It's a real mysterious lake. We fund research efforts continuously, and as I mentioned, in-lake water treatment that we do it as necessary. As I mentioned, right now, we're doing an alum treatment. That is expected to improve water quality for several years, which will afford us time to discover discover and eliminate sources of erosion and other sources of phosphorus that are coming into the lake. Our distribution system. Not only are we concerned about the lake, we're obviously concerned about the distribution system that we have. One thing that we put in place within the last couple of years is a joint water treatment operations. We've got it to the point now where we have a true jointly run facility up at the lake. We have a treatment manager, lab director. We've got water operators, one supplied by Lewiston, one supplied by Auburn. We've got lab technicians, again, one supplied by Auburn, one by Lewiston. They're all cross-trained and working quite well. It's a very unique setup that we have up there. I don't think there are any other water systems in Maine that come to mind that operate like we do and are able to operate like we do jointly. It's a real unique situation. We continually monitor the distribution system to make sure that we're meeting drinking water standards. And one thing that we've taken a special interest in is aggressively replacing our aging water mains. We still have a very old water system. We still have pipes out there that are over 100 years old. And so we are doing what we can to ramp up our efforts to replace as much of that as we can, as quick as we can.
Before you leave, especially for those who haven't seen it yet, take a look at the piece of pipe in the glass case there that was dug out of the street not too long ago.
At my house?
That's the kind of thing we gotta get out of here.
Right.
Wow.
So the bottom line, to wrap it all up, no matter how you look at it, whether you take this estimate, that estimate, it's very obvious that a filtration plant would be a large capital investment and significantly increase annual operation and maintenance costs. When you really think about it, it's clear, it's, you know, it just is that we need to focus our efforts on keeping our drinking water source clean for the benefits of the residents, businesses, and those that are visiting. Filtration may be required someday, but it's in everyone's best interest to continue along with our multi-barrier approach to water quality to make sure we can continue to deliver water, affordable, clean water 24/7.
Thank you, Sid.
And that's,
All the questions you stored up. This is your time to ask our expert.
I don't want to take over the time.
no, sure.
We're talking about the treatments that we've currently done, and you said you had a sort of a time frame on how long those treatments last.
Are you talking about the alum treatment?
Yeah, the alum treatment, and also the other, the copper sulfate that you did earlier.
Yep.
How long they last, and what we do if there's a sudden influx again, like you had back in
Sure.
earlier, that, you know,
Sure.
can we treat the lake again, or is there a limit to what we can do to keep the lake?
The copper sulfate treatment that we did last year, that's a 5-year permit that we had. We got that back in 2012, we renewed it in 2017. And last year, we actually had to exercise that and do it. That, that really is a one-shot, you know, a copper sulfate treatment is a one-shot deal to basically eradicate and kill any algae that might be present. In accordance with our permit, I think we are allowed, I have to go back and look at it, we are allowed to do, it's either 3 or 5 separate applications if we need to, but we're not planning another copper sulfate treatment. It's in our toolbox if we need it. If we did see a large spike in some algae that came up, we could do another copper sulfate treatment. But that's not a long-term strategy. That's just an immediate, you know, knock it down type thing. The alum treatment, on the other hand, is, we've got a 5-year permit to apply alum, and we could do, I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't, we can do multiple applications of alum if we need to. The application we're doing now is designed to last, if you look at the report that went into the application, it could be up to 12 years of improved water quality. If you take the detention time of the pond, and that is basically how long it takes, if a drop of water falls in the lake, how long does it take to get from the lake to the outlet? It takes 4 years. Lake Auburn has a very, very slow turnover rate, which is not a great thing, but it is what it is. And an alum application can be 3 to 4 times the turnover rate of the lake. For an alum application, it's a good thing to have a slow turnover, because it remains in your water longer.
And we used a fairly low dose.
We did very low.
So
Very low
being
dose.
conservative, you know, low dose, don't overdo it, so that if it didn't work out as well as you'd like, you got a chance to go back and do something again in a number of years. And it's one of those things, you find out how well it works by watching it and studying it.
And alum has been used in several lakes in Maine for a number of years. It was first done in a lake up in Rockland in the late 1980s. And it's been done across New England. It's not as common in Maine. It's done all the time down in southern Maine, southern New England states. But it has been done in Maine. It was done in Cocknowaga Lake up in Monmouth just this spring. They did an application. They did an original one 20 years ago, and they just did another one. East Pond up in the Belgrade Lakes was done last year. So it has been done before. It's not like we're breaking the mold here.
What was the cost of the copper sulfate treatment?
That was fairly inexpensive. That was, I wanna say that was only like, inexpensive, like I think it was $30,000 to $40,000. It was in that range.
And the alum treatment was 800,000.
Right. This was a much
Yeah.
more extensive
Plus
project.
engineering fees, 30,000 or whatever engineering fees, that stuff. So it's not cheap, but it's,
Yeah. One thing that that helped us, as Casey mentioned, it was a relatively low dose.
but it was still 800,000.
Right.
Now, does the
Mhm.
dose change the price, or is it just? the
It
cost?
would if the dose was up, it could have been triple that if we
Could
had
it really?
done up to like a 5
So-
milligram per liter dose.
That's the cost of the chemical,
Right.
alum,
Right.
is the labor cost would be the same.
Exactly, just these costs
Right.
of the chemical.
With a the dose that we're putting in is 2 milligrams per liter. And with that, we're doing that application over 3/4 of a lake. That if you add up all the chemical, it's over 250,000 gallons of aluminum that we're gonna be applying to the lake when it's all said and done. It's quite a lot.
Plethora of questions here. said that you considered other things like aeration and stuff.
Yeah.
Is there, I mean, you know, God forbid the situation gets worse, can you add that and hopefully lower the, you know, if you had to, I know we went with UV, could you try aeration? Cause I'm sort of interested in what happens if we lose the certificate for whatever reason. I mean, can we go back and say, oh, well, we're gonna try aeration, try to get that down, or what do we do in the interim if we lose the certificate on water? What do we do with drinking water?
Well, doing aeration just gets more oxygen in the lake, it doesn't really solve the problem of the phosphorus there.
I don't think aeration would be the option chosen. If we see the lake start to take a turn for the worse, we need to investigate where it's coming from, why it's happening. What we've done with this alum treatment is going to afford us the time to find these other sources of where the phosphorus is coming from. We do know that a fair amount of phosphorus is coming from Townsend Brook. And a few of the tributaries around that.
Kind of
One-
out of our control.
What's that?
Kind of out of our control. Like
Well,
so far,
not-
we haven't
not
been able
re-
to find it, it's not.
not
it's-
really.
It's
not
in the
really.
watershed.
But still, you
Well,
gotta. go after the
that
town.
also plays another, can you treat above, I mean, above the actual lake, can we treat the tributaries that are coming into it?
We can, we can actually, and one of the options that we did look at before we did an in-lake alum treatment, and something that they have had success in other areas is doing an alum dosing station. Like right where Townsend Brook comes into the lake, we could put in an alum dosing station that meters in alum as the water's coming in. If you get a large rainstorm, you know, the more water's rushing in, the amount of alum could be increased. That's something that's had a fair amount of success. The reason we didn't go with that is, at this time, the cost. An alum dosing station would be in the area of $150,000, and then you've got the, cost of the continuous chemical that would have to be added to it. That is an option. It wasn't the preferred option. What we're doing now is, that we've done the entire lake, is we're going to double down our efforts in these tributaries to find out if there is some smoking gun of, input that we can address.
Judging from what we just did last night, we gave our opinion on the overall forestry plan. The more vegetation and forest that you have around the lake is better. Basically what we sent on is that we agree with, to let the state take over the situation, simply because the fact that we have no monitoring tools, no experts in the field to help us with that, so is that utilizing state standards?
You mean on some of the city-owned property, or?
Well, in the forestry area around the city entirely.
We looked at forest, timber management, or timber,
Shoreline.
something, ordinance changing.
So we've gone to just letting the state, or we suggested going to letting the state handle that.
As I mentioned in one of those slides, part of the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission, one of the things that is monitored through them, if you will, is a active forestry management plan. Every 10 years, we have a new forestry plan updated. The last one we did was, 5 years ago, and we follow that plan, and we do actively manage our forests. It's managed for water protection, not for anything else. What we're trying to do is manage the forest so we have uniform growth of trees, have some small trees all the way up to large trees that have a big canopy, but we want the sun to be able to get down onto the ground, so we have varied growth. And we're also trying to promote the growth of softwoods over hardwoods, because hardwoods have the leaves that fall and they decay, wash into the lake, and give off tannic acid. So we're trying to manage the forest for more softwood species. So, and we do have an active forestry management plan, it's professionally managed.
I don't know if the planning board, because that was the last time I was joining, also looked at the forest management plan that the Forest Board has just updated as well.
We didn't see anything last night.
I wonder if anybody reached out though, because, they're part of conservation.
Well, it was sort of given to us as, you know, you have to give us your opinion on this. These are the three options that you get. You know, one is that we turn it over to the state completely. The other one is that we sort of keep a hand in it, but who monitors and who doesn't. And then the third option was, it's all yours. Happy days.
We own, we control about roughly 2,100 acres around the lake, and quite a bit of that is forested, so that's how we handle it anyway, is through our forest management plan.
Our other guests that are not regular trustees, I hope will answer their questions, because we can send ours to Sid or cover their next meeting. I know I've got a list, so I wanna make sure that, even if you think your list is long, Brian, we know them all, for the other, because we appreciate they came, right?
Well, we should know, we have two candidates for city council at this table, so, with Katie at large and Brian in Ward 4, so.
And Brian hasn't been on the tour yet,
and
I haven't
but
been on
does
the
want
tour
to,
yet.
and
Yeah.
we will arrange that shortly.
So it's a great
Katie's
time for
already
you
been out.
to ask
Yeah, so-
questions, and Sarah, of course.
So you'll have a chance to ask a lot of, you know, any of your questions, you know, as much as you wanna ask.
And Sarah, you're always welcome, so,
Thank you, but I'll defer, Katie, you go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have any current questions. Like I said, I did the tour and I had about 2 hours of time to pick Casey's ear and also Sid's as well, so their brains. So I really appreciate the presentation.
The Lake Auburn restrictions all the way, not the first time I've seen restrictions like this on the lake. The other one that I saw that was similar to this was a lake, up above Colorado Springs, actually, going up Pikes Peak. And we were looking at the lake and how beautiful it was and everything, and there happened to be a ranger shack on each end of the lake. And we were asking, oh, why do they have, you know, so much ranger presence up there? It's because that's the city aquifer. And, you know, there's nothing that goes on up there. It's very restrictive, and this, the reason why is because the water was so pure naturally that they didn't want to take any chances of losing any of that, so.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to say too is that this talk about filtration came about, myself and the mayor and a few others were concerned after that last algae bloom. And the concern was, as a community, do we want that every 3 or 4 or 5 years, having people coming in, say, our hotels and experiencing Auburn and Lewiston in that way? It didn't make sense. The water supply that had a bad reputation. Safe, but had a bad reputation. So we asked the city council if they wouldn't mind doing a study, an independent study on filtration, funding available, an actual cost, an independent third-party study, which would be maybe the council. They said, well, no, it's up to the water district to do that. So they teed it back to us. Now, it looks like we're going in the direction of, oh no, filtration is taboo, we're gonna avoid it, forget it, we're done, this discussion's over. But I wish that we could go in and really do an independent study on what the costs really are, what funding's available. We just overwhelmingly approved a $20 million bond for a high school, and $7 million, both cities overwhelmingly agreed to upgrading 911. There's $27 million just like that without even thinking about it.
Right, but there are a different group of people that are responsible.
But it's still, the water quality, safety,
Oh, right.
all these things.
Well,
So,
we haven't really decided never to study it. This is the first of our conversations
I'm
as
not sure.
trustees, and.
I don't think filtration's come off a decision, but what we heard today is the same thing. Our problem isn't safe drinking water, our problem is smelly, bad tasting
Right.
water, and it's algae. And today was the first time I heard, because I was at the beginning, when we really looked at filtration. John, remember those things John brought in, big filter pieces from some of these other districts? And the problem was they didn't handle algae. So in this wait, and while we take our 5, 10, 12 years, I'm hoping to come up with a solution, because clearly Auburn is the only person who has stinky water at times. Somebody else is gonna
I've
fix it.
lived in a lot of places, I've never had a problem with that.
Oh,
Well,
see, I
go-
tell you.
Go to Sulphur, Oklahoma.
Well,
The name and the water
Sulphur,
smell is
Oklahoma.
exactly the same.
But again, I'm hoping, I'd like us to look at this, not as filtration as the answer, but to again, I'm gonna always go back, that broader question, how do we address the issues we have with water? I'm happy to hear that at least now there are some filtrations that will address the algae in the sense of getting it out, but with no assurance of taste in that. I'd like some of our study to say, focus on our
Well,
problem,
you
which
talked
is
about
algae.
carbon, yeah, well, and you talk about there's carbon treatment, there's an extra couple million there, it looks like there are ways that we look into it
So
more.
I don't think we've taken it off, I think this was, for me, this was really great
Well,
to
it's
see
good to
the
have the information,
history.
it's pack history, that's right.
And I'm still open to discussing it, but I wanna start with the bigger question, how do we ensure safe quality drinking water, that now I wanna add, that tastes good and smells fine, you know, because, again, you're very lucky, maybe it's the travel, but even in Maine, you get stinky water, because whether it smells like cucumbers, which I prefer, to, chemicals, which is what you get in.
Chlorine.
Chlorine
Chlorine,
especially, yeah.
Yeah.
I had a question that, maybe is relevant, to this. It was I just made the assumption that the sequestering of phosphorus that the alum treatment is, doing, and would, by removing a significant amount of phosphorus from the system of the
Mhm.
water, would decrease the probability of algae blooms.
Yeah, 'cause they want.
Absolutely.
Because they want food.
Because that you don't get in trouble with the algae bloom, it doesn't come up unless there's some phosphorus to feed
To feed
the
it.
algae.
That's
Yeah.
exactly why we did it.
That's.
So is it
If there's
a
no
right
algae food, there's
assumption?
no algae.
What's that?
If there's no algae food, there's no
No
algae.
algae.
Right,
Yeah.
so my hope was, or is, that the alum treatment will, decrease the probability of algae blooms, at least for,
That's exactly why we did it.
It could be 2
Yeah.
years, could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be
I was
more.
gonna say, it could be 2 years, 3 years,
It-
we've had
it's not-
algebra
it's-
maybe 4 or 5 years anyway.
It's not a solution, we equate it to punting the football down the field. It's setting the clock back
right.
and giving us time to address the real issue, which is phosphorus.
And one of the things we agreed in our first workshop in May is that we were going to, as trustees, begin a review of filtration, and this is really the beginning of a process we haven't detailed out yet. Because I think if one sitting, soon to be former counselor, Tiz is a former counselor, two possibly future counselors here, and all of us who have, you know, a responsibility as trustees in the water district to providing, safe, affordable water. If we ever lost, despite the good work underway, if we ever lost the filtration waiver, we will need to understand what we will do. And when do you start the process of having Plan B in your back pocket? Because it won't be inexpensive to do the study. And so I think that's where we have a team of some good experts, but as trustees, we have a responsibility in working in partnership with the city to understand what is our Plan B. We hope we never don't lose our filtration waiver, but it could happen. And so, and how much time would we have, you know, before we'd have to
Well, that was
the study and put the parameters together.
That was my question, part of the question is, what happens if we lose the waiver? I mean, do we get a grace period, do we get
Yeah,
a period to
that's a
try
good
to?
question.
It doesn't happen like tomorrow.
They don't
Well,
say
Yeah,
that.
It's the government, so I know nothing
EPA,
past the government.
EPA would serve you, you'd argue back and forth, and you'd say, okay, well, we're gonna build a treatment plant, and we'll do it in the next 2 years or 3 years. It's not like, you know, they slam the door and say, stop delivering water to your whole city.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it would go through a lot of hands and,
Well, I like this presentation because it's more information than we've actually seen on it, you know, at least from our aspect of it. And having a ballpark, even a ballpark estimate, you know, we know that, you know, looking at the sizes of the plants that we would be looking at, giving us an idea of what the cost would be, should that happen. But I'm sort of agreeing with him, as far as we can punt it down the way, you know, and keep the quality of the lake where it needs to be.
Well, and one thing, I mean, I've only been a trustee for now almost 3 years. I have a great admiration actually for the water district's longtime efforts to accomplish two things: safe drinking water and affordable drinking water. And, you know, when you see us as in the lower third of cost, that says a lot for our residents who have lots of expenses. We don't have high water rates for something that's an essential part of life, is safe drinking water. And it's really good for business attraction. I think it is an opportunity that I hope economic development planners in the city are continually using as they market industrial sites here, is that we have low water and low sewer rates. And
And we have plenty of water.
and we have ample water. And that is an economic resource for this community because it's not expensive water. And, so I think, you know, it is this interplay, and we're gonna be talking about this, but we do have, I think Sid did a good job of saying, we have an increasingly aggressive pipe replacement program that does have to get paid for by ratepayers, and you try to be respectful to ratepayers, who incidentally comprise about 50% of the residents of Auburn, so we've got a 50-50 kind of community here. But we all depend on water, whether we have wells at home or not, because if you're gonna go anywhere, if you're gonna go have a glass of water at a restaurant, it's gonna be coming through our systems. But, so trying to be respectful, I think, around the affordability is, I think, a responsibility we also have, while not in any way ever compromising safety, which we wouldn't ever do, and the EPA won't let us, appropriately. So those are some of the trade-offs I've seen in these few years, and I have a healthy regard for the hard work of really lots of people over time who've done the same thing, trying to juggle all that. And fire protection. And I'm gonna say, as a relatively new trustee, Jason's relatively new. Some people here have been, you know, seasoned far more than some of us. I had no idea how the whole fire protection thing works. I know they have to have water to, you know,
That
but,
came up at our last rate increase, because people really, and the city's upset, and when you look at that rate increase of what it
Yeah.
means, that's why I quickly went to my tax bill.
yeah,
What it means to the
Yeah.
tax bill, it is substantial. And again, the angry voices come here to the water district, and this is the one place we have no control over. It's strictly set 100% what they pay by the state of Maine. So if you're unhappy, please
Talk
don't
to them.
beat up on
It's
the
roughly
staff in particular.
It's roughly 17% of our revenue, is how the formula works, goes towards fire protection. Because you wouldn't have to have a big reservoir if you didn't have fire protection. You wouldn't have to have certain bigger pipes. It's all calculated on capacity to push water fast, and you over-design for that, and then you're required, and rightfully so, to charge for the over-design and the ability to fight a fire.
but the
Randy
minute
also
there's a
said
big fire.
that not helps keep rates lower, because if we're not
Yes,
just
that's
spending that
right.
money, we're actually
Right.
using it as a revenue source, it keeps water rates lower, because
Yes, it
it's a
does.
windfall.
Yeah.
If we automatically get $100,000 more because we went up on the water rates, do we just spend that money, or does it help decide how we keep the rates
Well,
lower?
we also the hydrants require a lot of maintenance.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, you're talking about,
But they put both in,
so
to
you're
answer
talking
your
a
question.
20% increase in water rates. It's not all of a sudden a 20% increase in what it costs us to maintain hydrants. It's-
Right.
No,
Well,
we
it
use the
is-
money to.
It is to have bigger pipes and to have a bigger reservoir.
But not
You know,
more.
No,
I'm just saying,
All
I
that
think that
costs.
if there's more revenue in the water district coming in, that means that the rates can stay a little bit lower,
Yeah.
because there's extra revenue coming in
That's
from
right.
the city.
There's a margin.
It's paying for.
It's for
maybe
everybody to
more
pay
than
their
it should.
share.
And I guess because were you here when we did the last rate increase?
Yes.
So you remember that, I'm pointing down to Jason, but the guy in the corner that stood there, I can't remember. his
Whoever
name.
that guy was
Right.
where
Well,
Jason
he
said.
talked about, was it, if you think that this is interesting, watching how rate estimates come in was really interesting, but that came to play, because one, it came to play in how we set our rate, or recommended that
Because you
we
knew
set
that
our
extra
rate.
revenue was coming.
Right, which helped offset residential and,
Right.
and that, but the other thing that it, I lost the train, but that, yeah, does come in to the process that they use to have us have the money. The other side of it though, we did this the last rate increase, yes, there was some operational costs, as there are with any business, you gotta increase your revenue to cover the increase in just, I'm gonna call it the CPI.
Mhm.
But the other part of it is, we made a commitment, have made a commitment, and of course, my last breath in February is going to be
2 miles. of
3 miles
Oh, 3
of
miles.
pipe
Oh, it's
a
a
year.
three now.
When I arrived 7.5 years ago, we were a half a mile, 3/4, nobody really, and they did a very good job, but there was no target. We have, he said 130, I believe it's closer to 134, 5, 6 miles of pipe. On a 50-year plan, we have to do 3 miles of pipe. So we need our current 3 miles, and because they haven't done it for 2 decades, we need to be clicking off some of the past as well. That is going to take a rate increase, like it or not. And it is upsetting to hear city councilors, this is my pitch here, come to a rate increase presentation and say, well, don't raise it, we can't afford it, just push off the maintenance. The community's done that for at least 40
That's how you
years.
end up with pipes that look like
Yes,
that.
so we're, when we plan this, the pricing, I thought you did an awesome job in getting some real prices, by the way, because I've always felt like it was just in the air. You did a great job. But one thing that I didn't see there, because it didn't look big enough on maintenance, did they include the 1 to 2% that's the typical cost for maintaining the facility? It's usually 1 to 2% of construction costs per year if you're going to do it right. Huh? But was that included in the $750,000, or was that?
1.5.
Yes.
Right, but it was that included in that, that's what I wanna know is, was the maintenance of the
Just
facility?
basic building maintenance.
Right, because remember, we have operations, we run a city and we run a school, and we don't put that doesn't include that 1%, and they never put it in the budget.
But that $35 million could be easily $50 million.
Right, but I don't
If
care
you
what the
went out and
number is,
designed it.
I'm
So-
concerned is the 1 to 2%
It's-
included in this
It'll probably-
that's my question for the future, Sid, it doesn't have to be
The
answered
operational
tonight.
costs.
In your operational
Like building
costs, did it
management.
include?
Building maintenance costs.
Yes, the 1 to 2% of
Things
this.
like cleaning the toilets and.
That's operational to me, that's,
Okay.
I'm talking about making sure the bricks stay on the
Oh,
wall, and the roof,
basically, and the roof
all the
doesn't-
stuff that you
Yeah.
do to
HVAC,
maintain
okay.
a building.
Duly
which-
noted,
Yeah,
that's
I
good.
have, 2 questions relating to this, maybe you can answer these later too. One of them, what are the things that will cause us to, what categories will cause us to lose filtration if we should lose it?
The waiver.
Number 1, lose the waiver filtration.
What would make us lose it
What are the
is if we
categories?
fail to meet the drinking water
So what are those,
standards.
I mean, what is it,
It
the
triggers
phosphorus
yeah,
too high?
turbidity,
Which
if,
is phosphorus, high phosphorus causes that?
Um,
Cloudy.
yep, the cloudiness of the water, if we go over a 5,
Okay,
then we would most
Anything
likely
else?
lose it. Or if we get, a large number of bacteria hits that we couldn't account for or resolve.
Like the seagull bacteria.
yeah.
Yeah, that was
That
close.
was one of it.
That was
That was one of them.
Yeah.
But we
Um,
showed that we can control it.
Yeah, it's all a matter of not meeting some drinking water standard. There's a huge list of
So there's a bunch of
things.
stuff.
Yep.
And then the other question I would have is, and this is probably not the wrong group to ask this question. Are there benefits to filtration? Or is what we're saying now is no better than what we have right now?
I immediately thought we're gonna employ more people, that's a benefit.
Yeah, I'm talking about the water quality. So
Oh.
what we're saying is, it's no different than what we got right now, so we gotta keep it. Or
It,
are there true benefits to
That's a good question,
filtration?
if we.
I mean, obviously, cause yeah, if the
If we
EPA
did
is
the
saying we gotta
bullet
do
and
it,
invested the money and had a filtration system, how would the water?
are there any benefits? Cause so
Would
far
the
I
water
haven't heard.
taste-
I would say overall, I mean, if we had a full filtration plant,
Yep,
um,
money's no object.
Well,
That's-
Well, this community thinks so, when we buy a 911 communication
Just
systems
so
at a big
this
high
is
school.
here, would
money's
the water
not-
taste different? The mental
I'd
idea.
say that it would improve the water quality. I mean, that's what a filtration plant does.
Yep.
So it's part of that.
Would you notice it? Probably not.
I don't think you would, I really don't.
I wonder how-
Considering the amount of water a person consumes in a day.
You know, well,
Well, I don't know anybody that drinks out of
Would it
tap.
mean you
it
didn't?
would
I
make more,
do.
if you're
I
drink
really.
all tap
No
water.
wonder, no wonder you're so
Nothing
angry.
else.
No
If
wonder
you're
you're
really
so
trying-
angry.
71 and look at me.
If
That's all I
you're really
drink.
trying
No
to
wonder you're so angry.
improve, if you're really trying to improve water quality, where you'd spend your money is on the distribution system. When you got pipes that look like that, I don't care if you're putting distilled water through it, your water quality is not gonna be.
Yeah, well, that's obviously a big, why we're trying to increase the
So
mileage.
the taste is.
Which is why I want us to
think
bond
we
and get it
could-
done instead of
I
take
think
30
we're
years to
improving.
fix.
So the taste is affected by the old pipes.
What's that?
The taste is affected
Oh,
by the old
definitely,
pipes.
yes, yes. Well, you can imagine what the water tastes like coming out of that.
Is that calcite, calcium, or what?
That's
what is-
iron deposits.
Iron?
Yep, that's, stuff that's leached out of the pipe, just, sediments that have built up over the years.
Is there anything that we add to the water right now that might deplete any of
That
that?
came out of New Auburn.
That might.
Deplete that scale?
Yeah,
Deplete it?
Maybe-
Are there any chemicals we put in the water currently
Either
that could
clean it out
potentially
or
the
deplete
phos-
any of
yeah.
it?
Well, the phosphate that we put in coats that, so that helps a lot. If we didn't put in the phosphate, then you'd see a lot of that coming through,
A lot more.
yeah.
Yeah.
right.
But it also keeps the lead from leaching out.
And the one thing we do also with our water treatment, as I mentioned, the two chemicals we add for pH and alkalinity, by adjusting our alkalinity up, that tends to stabilize the water, so it's not causing that stuff to leach out into the water. That helps as well.
Actually, that was one of my questions, Sid, is what is the alkalinity of water? Cause I know an alkaline
It's about 20.
water
we
is much
try
better
to keep it in
than
the low
the acidic.
20s, 22 milligrams per liter.
And what amount of time has to pass before you can safely do another alum treatment?
When you need it.
we
When
could
you need it.
We
That's
could,
the answer.
I'm just thinking that it could be, effective for anywhere from 2 to 12 or more years, but when could you do it
You
again
can
if
do
you
it
need it?
when you need it.
Okay.
There's no law
time
saying
frame.
you can't do it for 5 years, you just,
Mhm.
you look at your test results and you're having problems, and the experts, and there are people that are experts would say, we gotta do this again and this kind of dose, and go to the cities and say, okay, $400,000 each last time, we gotta do X, but that would develop over the course of several seasons, I would bet.
some reservoirs down in southern New England do it every year.
One other question too, is anybody talked about climate change and how that is affecting the future of this? Everybody's talked about climate change being a problem. Are we gonna see more problems with the lake, not because of our own whatever we're doing,
Well,
but simply because of climate change?
I will say, we are seeing, we have data on ice in, ice out
Yeah.
on the lake. On the
And that affects,
average,
yeah.
on the average, the ice is forming later every year and it's coming off earlier.
And the lake
So what
is-
does that mean?
The lake is
That
getting
means
warmer,
there's more time that the
Then-
lake is exposed to sunlight.
then
Which
you got
means
more chance.
possibility for
More
phosphorus,
algae.
more algae. That's, I mean, that's why that's a benefit to filtration, I would assume, is.
No?
No,
No?
doesn't solve the algae problem.
Well, I
Our
thought it
problem
did.
is algae,
Yeah.
and we've gotta fix the algae, and for the first
Well,
time
he
I've
said
heard
there was
there's
a carbon,
some.
there was a carbon filtration part that he was talking about.
That could help, but it's not,
Yeah.
it's not a guarantee that it's going to eliminate all the taste and odor.
You still get the cucumber
You keep
taste.
the lake clean first. Filtration is only after you're brought in and tried to treat it.
Once you've exhausted,
You have to keep it out of the lake.
The dirtier it is going in, the more you're gonna spend on filtration trying to clean it.
I think that is all of these things are really important to remember, and I think there are a number of people who are really increasingly understanding the science of this, who are lay people such as me, is that a huge goal here is actually to try to prevent the establishment of permanent algae colonies in the lake. That once they're there, we're really, as a community, not just a water district, as a community, we will have an unhealthy lake. And one thing, it's a gigantic problem in New England, and, we can see even now, article after article about how some of the algae blooms, it's not healthy for dogs to drink it, you know, so it's, aside from filtration and what it does for drinking water quality, the fundamental issue of keeping a healthy lake so that we have a healthy lake. In addition to not, and that the filtration system doesn't really resolve all the algae issues. I think that's a really important part of the equation that we sometimes forget, is about filtration will be the solution to everything, and then we can do whatever we want.
Well, no,
I hear that, right, so I just.
yeah.
I'm really interested in hearing more about what you mentioned about people not drinking water. I've never heard that. Is that
I won't drink the water.
common? So what do you
A lot of
drink,
people,
what do you drink
I
instead?
Poland Spring bottled water.
Bottled water at home?
At home, I mean, I use the water for cooking and stuff, but to actually pull it from the tap.
Every restaurant in town delivers tap water.
I'm drinking it right now.
There we go. But I mean, obviously, there's
That's
certain
what's
times
wrong
when
with
it's
me.
worth-
Right, we have an answer.
I'm going home to tell my wife.
Sid, a question, the mention of the turbidity,
Right,
that
turbidity,
highlights that
right.
if the water's cloudy at all, and the maximum number of allowed is 5.
5, yep.
And ours is a 1 point something most of the time.
Right now, it's a 0.5.
Wow.
Well, that's
It's
after
been
the
very,
altitude.
this has been
It
an
is-
extremely
It's down,
good
but-
year.
It was getting up near 3.
The highest we got is about a 3.
Then that's when we hit it with
Back-
copper sulfate, and that knocked it down.
Back in 2012, when that first incident came up, it was up in that area too.
So do you think that the, good, transparency now, the lack of turbidity is related to the alum treatment that?
You know,
Mhm.
I'd like to say yes. However, it's really hard because we don't have any data to know what would have happened if we hadn't done it. I will say that the lake looks really good right now. We're doing an alum treatment, so I'd love to say this is why it's good, but I stopped short of saying that because the scientist in me needs comparative data.
Yeah.
And unless we had a Lake Auburn here and a Lake Auburn here, this one we treated, this one we didn't. I can say that the lake is doing well, but, unless I had something to compare it to, I couldn't say that's the only reason why. It could be a natural cycle.
Oh.
Or we could
But
find,
it could be the alum treatment,
It
you could
could,
say
or-
that.
yes.
or the lake, or the lake
We
could
hope
be,
so. I mean,
could be
you
like
know.
this for the next 5 to 7 years, and we say, gee, that was the smartest thing we ever did.
I will say,
So,
every lake
You
that
do
an
smart
alum treatment
things.
has been done has been successful. That was a real big thing for us. You look at every lake that's ever been done, and they're better off for having it done. There are a lot, every lake where it's been done, the lakes are crystal clear.
Back to, Andy's question about, climate change.
Yeah.
One of the fascinating sets of slides in Dr. Ewing's presentation on, the history of Lake Auburn is she has precipitation and temperature data on time charts back into the 1700s. And she's done core samplings down into the sediments so that they can look at algae levels back to that far back and before Europeans were even in the area. And she has a couple of slides in her presentation which are truly fascinating in showing climate change. And she has also in that matrix, ice in and ice out dates, but more episodes of extreme precipitation, more episodes, the degree days is one of her slides. So you can really see right in our lake, the effect of the change since 1950 in the lake in trim data. And she has a couple of slides that go back to data into the 1700s to the extent some of that data, some of us have seen her presentation is available. But in her core samplings, she then, I mean, this is true science. She can see what was happening from the core in the sediments in those years, so cause she can date the sediment back. So we are living, and with the example of, not rising sea, but changes to the lake, among other things. It's fascinating, a little concerning too.
How many miles of pipe does Lewiston have? I know we're
A little more than us.
Really?
Yeah, not
That
a
surprises me.
ton more. They have a little bit more than us.
But a greater percentage of their population is on municipal
It's
water.
urbanized, right? Lewiston is urbanized from every corner. So they do have a larger population.
So that explains,
Yeah.
pipe volume. Cause the people I know are people, my family in Lewiston doesn't drink the water in Lewiston.
Oh, they don't?
And I said, it's from the same lake, you know.
Do they not treat the holding facilities? Do they not treat the holding facility?
The reservoirs,
Mhm.
yeah, those are not treated.
No, cause I used to live over underneath the reservoir over there in Lewiston, just by Montello School. And that's what I always say, oh, we just added a little bit too much chlorine up on the hill.
It's added on Main Street, or it used to be added at the bottom of Main Street.
Yeah.
They do have mixers, but they do not add any more chemical.
Well, it's getting to be kind of
Yeah.
8:10, and I think maybe, as trustees, we can always ask the question, but if any of the others who are, Katie, Brian,
Very good
I
presentation.
have a real quick one.
oh,
Okay.
yeah, not trying to
Well,
cut anybody
well,
off.
it's just a, no, it's a kind of geeky one, but,
Sid likes
in,
those, actually.
in Holly Ewing's talk, she, focused on cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, and, I just wanted to ask if a filtration system could take out blue-green algae, like
It-
as a coagulant?
It can take it out, but it might not get rid of the odor.
But it,
It might not get rid of the odor and
right,
taste issues.
right, and also the toxins, that are released by the blue-green algae?
Not all blue-green algae give off toxin, and we have had blue-green algae in the lake. We do not have any right now at the current time, but we have. Last September, when we did the copper sulfate treatment, one of the reasons why is because that was the blue-green algae last September that we had in the lake. And that's why we did the treatment to bat it down before it became a full bloom condition, because once you get a full bloom, then it dies, then it can release toxins. And every test we've done, the strain of blue-greens we have never detected any toxins that came from it. I don't know if you look across the country, you heard about the dogs that drank the water and died.
Yeah,
Those were blue-green algae blooms where the toxin was released and they consumed that. But, we've never detected any toxins from any of the blue-greens. There is, algae is such a complete science, I'm not qualified to even really talk about it, I'm really not.
But if there were toxins, or it would take the toxins out and the algae just couldn't possibly, maybe you
When-
could take out the smell, but not.
When the
for sure.
blue-green algae die, they can give off toxins, they don't always, so if you're asking if a filter plant could take out the toxins, I'm not,
Above your.
I don't feel
above your pay
comfortable
grade.
in answering
Yeah.
that, I really don't.
yeah.
Yeah.
But if that were the case, we couldn't get it without UV either, so we'd be in deep trouble. So-
UV, UV doesn't remove anything, it
No.
deactivates
Right,
it.
just the
Yeah,
bacteria.
it scrambles up the DNA,
Yeah.
so it can't,
So anything
proliferate.
can't reproduce.
Right.
So just kind of bringing this back together, I mean, I think that there are many conversations that we will have in our community about filtration. Many conversations we will have together here, because it is a topic that does come up and it's on some people's minds, and it's a healthy community engages these conversations with informed discussion and, getting professional information if and when we need it. And we know that won't be free, but there may be opportunities to get some support if we need it. But I think this is what a healthy community does, is have these conversations. What I appreciate, Sid, in your excellent presentation is for all of us as trustees, for people in the community, two who are on the planning commission board now and who may, if elected, become future counselors, and Sarah as a committed citizen, you know, the more any of us knows about what's already been invested in. I mean, the thing that I believe in very strongly is we've already invested as a community in these studies. So it's the place to begin, is to understand what we've learned from studies already commissioned, or the word that I've never heard before, commandeered.
I like that.
And because that's how you can then say, this we know from what we've invested in, what next do we know? What do we learn from it? What else do we need to know? And a community needs to have these conversations. And the science of it is, I think, getting interesting to many people and complex as well. I have a feeling this is a roadshow presentation.
I already wrote my little note, I was gonna wait till after the meeting's over to ask Sid if he would, if I could arrange for a community presentation.
The more people who have a chance to
In a nice
learn.
location,
Yeah,
is bigger,
yeah.
and we'll provide.
Thank you for
food.
coming, Sarah.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sarah, is this your
Sarah's-
jacket?
I always forget something, sorry.
So on that note,